Gabrielle, welcome to the Virtual CMO Podcast. So glad you could join us today.
Thanks, Eric. It's really good to be here with you.
I've had so many fantastic guests from down under. I don't know what it is. It seems like, New York, I thought would be the hot spot for a lot of marketing related guests, but it turns out that it's Australia.
Yeah, I think down under, maybe we have to be really good at marketing to sort of be seen and heard, being so far away from everyone else.
Maybe that's it. Whatever it is, it's working. And I'm delighted to have you on the show today because we're going to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is all around storytelling and specifically around brand stories. Why do you think this is so hard for companies to get this right?
I think it is hard for them to get it right. I think there's a couple of things, and it was probably one of the couple of the reasons I wrote the book is fundamentally I'm not sure people know what a story is. So what I would see is companies saying this is our brand story, and I would look at it and go, so which part of that is a story, would you say? It was like, so they mistake, for example, a timeline is not a story. I think the other thing, they think it's one story. So you can't, and you just can't communicate your entire brand with one story.
Right.
So I think they actually, they confuse brand story as I've heard people say, brand story is we've got a slick corporate video, or it's our narrative, or it's our logo, or it's our tagline. It's like that's not a brand story. So I think it's the fundamental understanding of what it actually is or are brand stories.
When I see so many businesses, they say our product or service, it speaks for itself. It's so good. People know what it is. I don't need to tell a story about it. Look at the features that it has.
Yeah, yes. Or think the brand story is about the product and features what they have. But it doesn't matter how good your product is or your service is. If people don't know about it, then they won't even get to experience it for a start.
Yeah. Well, I live here in Orlando, Florida, so we're very familiar with storytelling here. We've got the big theme parks, and there are a lot of places around town that seem to have integrated stories into their brands, their establishments. There's always a little element of entertainment in a lot of things that happen around here. And obviously it works if you look at the power of a company like the Walt Disney Company or Universal and what they've been able to do. It's all about stories.
Yeah, and the Disney company use stories well internally. So, for people that come and work for Disney, their whole onboarding process it's just story filled. It's they're hearing stories about the history, they're hearing stories about why we did this type of thing, and they're learning stories, especially the customer facing employees. They're hearing the stories which they can then tell to customers. So yeah, Disney, you would imagine Disney do storytelling well.
Mm-hmm. How do you separate this idea of a brand story just from a brand's history? I think sometimes people think, well, this is the story of our founder, or this is the story of how we came into existence, two companies merging together, or whatever the case may be. But it's not always a historical context, right?
No, and I think that's Eric, when you said where do companies go wrong, I think one of the reasons they go wrong is they just relay the history, and they think by telling the history, it's the story. The problem with that is the history tends to be filled with a lot of dates and facts. And, in 1972, this company and this company merged to become this company. And it's sort of like, it's a little bit boring, actually. It was like, and because we're not engaged in that. But there's a lot of companies that have a strong history that can still tell their story. So they can tell the story of the founder, but it's a real story about why did they start the company. And so I call those creation stories about why the company started, but it can also be why the product started. And that's another thing too. So not only when did we release this product, or when did we merge with a company, but why did we? Why did we start the company? Why did we merge? Why did we release that product? Because there's always stories behind them, and they're more engaging, and people connect with them more than just when we did it.
So you've written this book, which you sent me a copy, which is amazing, by the way. I think it's so useful in the way that it's even laid out. It's very actionable and very digestible, but you call it Magnetic Stories. And for the audience who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, what are the elements of a magnetic story?
Yeah, maybe, ironically, maybe I'll share a story about why I called it Magnetic
Yeah, that's
Stories. It
great.
was,
That's perfect.
because I did, whenever you write a book, Eric, it's like I have a working title in my head, and it never ends up being the actual title,
Yeah.
because, ironically, the publishers, the marketing people in the publishing, my publishers, Wiley, get behind it and suggest other names, and you go, oh yeah, that's better. But this one, actually, the name did come from me, and I was actually thinking I need a term that describes, because the power of a story, the power of a really good brand story, is that you can have this instant connection to it, like an instant automatic attraction, like bang,
Yeah.
that once you've heard that story, it's like really hard to pull away from. It's really hard to forget that story. And that's almost the concept of brand loyalty too. Once you have an attraction, you sort of don't even pull away from it. So I was trying to think what's like that. And then magnet came to my head, where, like a magnet, you pull two magnets together, they just go bang together, and they're very, very, very hard to pull. You've almost got to force yourself to pull them apart. And that's the power of a really good story. A funny side comment is, my husband was also thinking of a story, of a title for the book, and he came out one day and he goes, I've been thinking, and I reckon I've got the perfect title for your book. And I went, what? And he went, Teflon Stories. And I went,
Stories.
that is like the complete opposite of what I go, Teflon, it slips off. I go, that's the complete opposite of what I want. He went, oh yeah, good point. Stick with magnetic.
So you gave him a copy of the book for Christmas. And
I gave him, read this.
So, no, go ahead. Keep going.
I was going to say, so that's the concept of the brand stories in the book, is finding these stories that people have can attract to the brand, connect with the brand. I'll share a little example of one of the stories in the book, because it's probably one of my favorite stories.
Yeah,
and I think it really highlights the power of what a really good brand story can do. Is when I was growing up, Eric, I was a bit of a tomboy. I'd spend most of my time playing football or cricket or riding my BMX bike or skateboard. That's what I did. And I wasn't really into dolls. And so I never had a Barbie. And over the last few decades, when Barbie has been, got a bit of a bad name as being a bad role model for girls, unattainable body image, I happily went along with that story. I've got two daughters who are now 17 and 20, and I never bought them a Barbie. And I might have even been so strong against it that I told people not to buy them a Barbie, which is quite ridiculous. But anyway, I did it. When I was researching for the book, I came across the backstory to Barbie. And Barbie was invented by Ruth Handler, who was the wife of one of the co-founders of Mattel, which make the Barbie product. And what she noticed in the 50s, when her two children, she had a son and a daughter called Ken and Barbara. And yes, Ken and Barbie are named after her children. But what she noticed is, when they were playing with their respective dolls, both of them imagined themselves as adults. But while Ken he was encouraged to imagine himself as an astronaut or a firefighter or a superhero, Barbie could only ever imagine herself as a caregiver. That was the dolls. So she suggested this idea of a 3D doll with fabric clothing so the little girl could, pretend to be someone else and imagine herself as someone else besides a caregiver. And initially they didn't agree with it, but she persisted. And in 1959, on the 9th of March, and I remember that date because it's my birthday, not the 1959 bit, the 9th of March bit, Barbie debuted at the New York Toy Fair, and, the rest is history, clearly. But there's a quote from Ruth Handler that says, "My whole philosophy with Barbie was that through the doll, the little girl had choices, that Barbie always represented that women could be whatever they wanted to be." And when I heard that story and read that quote, it completely changed my perception of the Barbie brand. And not only completely changed my perception, more importantly, will influence my future buying habits. So I never bought my girls a Barbie doll, but I might just buy Barbie dolls for any future grandchildren that come along. But the and again, one of the reasons I wrote the book, such a missed opportunity that story, I had to really research and find that story, that story is not front and center on their website, and that story is not on every single Barbie packaging, because that is a magnetic story. And when people read the book, the most feedback I get, as an author, I would hope I get feedback about how great the book is, which I do. But the first initial feedback people give me is, I have completely changed my opinion of Barbie. That's the biggest feedback I get from them reading the book and that story.
That's so interesting, because even as you're telling it here, I'm sort of glued and listening to it, and where's this going, and what's the outcome of this, and it's amazing when you say it like you did, when you frame it as a story, we can sort of put ourselves in those characters or in those people's lives and sort of see how this might have played out and at a certain point in time. And it's just amazing how much more effectively that communicates what that doll really represented than, as you say, what was on the packaging or our perceptions of what it has been over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the power of story, whether they're brand stories or whether they're, I do a lot of work working with companies to help them communicate internally their strategy and their values. But it's, if leaders are sharing personal stories or sharing stories, that's the power of story. As humans, we are hardwired to communicate through stories. We are hardwired to share stories. We're hardwired to listen to stories. It's the way we communicate. But yet in business, we communicate with facts and figures and bullet points and product features, and it's boring, and it's just the wrong way to communicate to humans.
As I'm a huge Apple fan, I love all Apple technology and always have. And about once a year or so, I go back to YouTube and I replay the video of Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone for the first time. And it's a business school case study, right? In storytelling, in really defining a problem and talking about how this product is being introduced to solve a specific problem. And the way that he does it is so masterfully, and you can just see that the audience is on the edge of their seats as this is unfolding and wondering what this thing is going to be, even though there were rumors about what was going to be released ahead of time. And I just love that. And it's interesting to me how many companies have a hard time duplicating that. Some try, but it seems to be very difficult for many companies to really frame a problem. Do you think conflict is necessary as part of an element of a story, that you have to have something that you're resolving?
No, not necessarily. And so I know, like, a whole concept of a story is like the hero's journey and the arc, where, there's something's happened and we've overcome it. And while that actually does make for a good story when you overcome obstacles, there doesn't, I'm sort of saying yes and no, because it doesn't have to be a really big obstacle or challenge. It could just even be, when people share a story and just share the self-doubt they had in themselves, like even that can be, that can be a challenge to overcome. So I guess my answer is yes, but don't think of the challenge that it's got to be this big major thing that, you've got to overcome. It just could be an element of self-doubt. But I love the fact that you I'm a fan of Steve Jobs. He was a sensational storyteller. In fact, there's a quote that I often do. It's Steve Jobs, and he says the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come. And I think that's why he was such a great CEO or leader of Apple, is because he was a storyteller. And through his stories, he set the vision and the agenda for the entire organization, but also for generations to come. And also with Apple, I often use Apple as an example. People buy on emotion. So what story does, story taps into emotion. We connect with stories on an emotional level. And just as you said, if you overcome a challenge, we relate to that, and we've all done that thing. So stories tap into emotion, and that's why they're so powerful, and that's why we connect with it. And the reality is, people buy on emotion. They don't buy on logic. Anyone in traditional sales roles or marketing roles know this. They will tell you people buy on emotion. and rationalize through logic and justify through logic. And because all you'd have to look at, when Apple release a new product and people are lined out overnight, stretching around the corner to buy the product when they could literally buy it online,
Right.
that is emotion. There is nothing logical about that. They're buying on emotion. And so that's what stories do. Stories tap into emotion.
I love that you read that quote. And, sometimes as a podcast host, I'm reluctant to use Apple as an example because it's overused, but it's not overused.
It's overused for
company in the world, right? So
it's overused for a reason. Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly
it's overused. Yeah, and I see a lot of people go, I know Apple's overused, but it's overused for a reason because they're bloody good at what they do.
They do, and they continue to do that. Maybe not with the same flair that Steve Jobs had, but they still have those elements of story in just about everything that they do. One of the things that I've noticed, and they've been complimented on, is during COVID, they could no longer do their live events, so they went to pre-recorded video events. But they were some of the most spectacular recorded video events I've seen for a business purpose. They had very high production values, and they told a story. They really walked people through. And so, yeah, they're firm believers in the power of story. And I told you before the show that one of the examples that you had in the book hits close to home. It's located here in Tampa. It's a restaurant called Columbia. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in your reference to Columbia is, yes, there's a story for the restaurant itself. There's some history. They're in a historical neighborhood, in a historical building. But it's just the little ways they bring that story into something as simple as a menu item. Could you share with the audience that?
Yeah, and I loved writing this book because I got to speak to so many different companies from around the world that were doing such cool things with storytelling. And Columbia Restaurants is a great example of. And again, when we talk about the brand story, it's not the narrative. I sort of almost vomit a bit when I hear the word narrative because it's like, it's our narrative. And so what they're trying to do is create one story that sort of explains the whole sort of company or brand, which, which is, I guess it sort of is the narrative. But to me, a narrative is all the little stories you can share about everything. So, Columbia Restaurants, they've got a big chandelier in their, restaurant, and there's a story behind that. There's a fountain out the front, and there's a story behind that, like where it came from, why they got it. When I interviewed Columbia Restaurants, so I should say I was alerted to Columbia Restaurants in Florida by a friend of mine who went there and sent me a photo of their menu, because on the menu they have little micro stories, just like little mini stories about, it could be a dish, and this was, because it's a fifth generational company. It's the oldest restaurant in Florida, actually. So little stories on their menu, stories on their wine list. If you go to their website, it's like just story after story. It's actually like a little bit of a Netflix movie. It's like, I've never read a about us section on a website and wanted to know more. That's their use of stories. When I contacted them and interviewed for them with the book, I spoke to the marketing comms person there, and the first question I asked them was, when did they get involved in storytelling? Like, when did they realize the power of stories? And I was sort of expecting them to say, 10 years ago or something. 1942.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah. So what they did is they hired a journalist that would come and sit at the bar at the Columbia Restaurants and write stories about the barman that had been there for 20 years, and write stories about customers that have been coming for 20 years, and they just wrote stories about characters, or wrote stories about the chandelier, or the beautiful mosaic artwork they had, but it was always the story. And they said, yes, it was, and they would be published in newspapers. So yes, it was sort of advertising, but it never felt like advertising because it was always done in a story. And they're just using stories amazingly. We talked about when people come onboarding, for people that work with them, they hear all these stories. So they hear the stories about the chandelier, and their whole onboarding program is just story after story after story, because then the customer facing staff, the waiters and bar people and stuff, can share those stories with the customers. And what they've realized, that when a story is behind everything, I think one of the things they talk about is it's just not, you're not coming here to eat, you're coming here for an experience. And they actually call it the Columbia experience. So it's through the stories that a simple going out for dinner turns into a dining experience as opposed to just eating.
Well, that was one of the things you talk about in the book as well, is the importance of really pulling employees into the story, right? It can't just be something that lives in the About Us section of the website.
No, and that's another thing. It's like, don't just, I mean, yeah, put it in the About Us section. It might be interesting, but there's very few people reading that. It's where are these stories, and being really creative with where you put the stories. Like, Columbia did it on their, wine menus and stuff like that. I think their wine menu is about 240 pages long because there's stories about all the vineyards they use. So it's using how you share those stories both internally and externally, so both to your employees and to your customers. And I think through social media, those channels are merging, that a lot of companies are sharing things directly, like let's say, for example, directly on LinkedIn or Facebook. Sure. And so by default, they're communicating to both their customers and employees. So just get really creative. I interviewed another company. This is a Melbourne-based company, another family-owned bakery, and they shared little mini stories on coffee cups and things like that. And just having fun with the way they shared stories. I think one of those little micro stories they use was, in 19 whatever, their main bakehouse burnt down, and they had things like 1,000 pies lost their lives, and so they just make it a little bit funny. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Facebook, social media. One of the sections that you have in your book talks about the changing trends. I think you list 4 trends that are really changing as people build out these magnetic stories. Can you talk to those a little bit, and how things are really starting to change as brands start to work on building these stories? What do they have to be aware of with all this noise out in the marketplace right now?
Yeah, and it is. So first of all, there's a lot of noise. That's information overload. That's not a trend. That's been around for a very long time, but it's still here, and it's not going away. It's getting worse. What's happening is more and more employees are working for companies that are aligned to their values. So it's being clear of what your brand stands for. And to me, a brand is the values of your company. It's not the products. It's not the products. It's the values. It's the culture of how we do this. So employees more and more are looking to work for companies that they're proud to work for. So you want to be able to be communicating the values at your companies. Customers are more and more making products or choice of the products based on, again, the values of the company.
Yes.
I think the younger generation are driving that. I mentioned before, I've got 2 daughters, 17 and 20, and it's actually sometimes quite painful to go shopping with them, because I will pick something up and they go, "Mum, do you know that company has slave labor or whatever, or do you know that that company, you should be buying this company because they're sustainable and they donate money to," and they know all this. And it was like, oh, okay. And it was like, so more and more employees are making really informed choices around that. The other trend is, the way we communicate, social media and the way we can communicate internally and externally is changing. So how we use stories to sort of cut through all the noise on social media. And also the other one that is quite recent, this cancel culture, which I had, never really heard of a couple of years ago, but this power of, a story can get out there and people can just, it sort of, it goes with celebrities, but it goes with companies. We're refusing to buy from you based on something. So, and it could be a story out there that is true, by the way, but it's so how do you change that, and how do you then proactively put the positive stories out there? So I'm not talking about marketing spin or anything, but if a company has stuffed up and done the wrong thing, or a celebrity or whatever, then how do you sort of proactively acknowledge that, but then, talk about the positive things that are happening because of it?
Well, I love it because what you're really getting at is authenticity, right? You can't create a story around your brand. You can't make up some values that your brand stands for. If you're not an environmentally friendly brand, you can't greenwash over that. That's a term that's come up. You have to be authentic. And it sounds like what you're really saying is that these trends really are in support of that, is that you have to stand for something. You have to put that story out there. You have to be true to it. And then you have to be aware of what's being said about you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, it all comes back to authenticity. You can't fake this stuff. It's being clear on your brand, and that's whether you're an individual or a company. We all have brands. Every single one of us have brands. My favorite definition of a brand comes from Jeff Bezos, where he said that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. My variation on that, my little tweak on that, is it's the stories people share about you when you're not in the room, because ultimately people will tell stories. So, if I spoke to someone and said, hey, Eric's asked me to come on his podcast, what's he like? They might go, yeah, he's good or bad, but they'll ultimately, if I push, they'll tell me a story about, I went on and he did this and then he did this. And so it's the stories people share about you. So you need to take control of that. You need to be aware of that, but it stems down to authenticity. You can't pretend, or you can pretend, but people are going to see through it. And companies can't be sharing, like you said, can't be sharing stories about how, they're doing all these great things in the environment, but actually doing something different. So I think that's when real cancel culture will come in, if you sort of get caught out.
I agree with you completely. And as I said, I really enjoyed reading the book. And it's an actionable book, when you've got bookmark flaps on both the front and the back covers, right? Because clearly there are sections in this book that you want to set aside and come back to.
Yeah, but I should have, Eric, I should have done it like a cookbook where you've got little ribbons you can.
You're right, that you can pull down and mark the sections. No, I'd highly encourage people to take a look at the book. And so as we sort of wrap up the podcast here today, I'd love it if you could just tell people more about the book, where they can find it and where they can connect with you online.
Yeah, so the book Magnetic Stories is it's in all good bookstores. There's probably in some pretty crap bookstores as well. But you can get it from all the usual, Amazon, online. It's online. It's an e-version. It's an Audible version as well. It's not me talking, the Audible version, but you can get it from all your bookstores. If you're interested in storytelling, either for, and how you go about, implementing it in your company, the best thing is go to my website, GabrielleDolan.com. There's a 7-day storytelling starter kit. So it's free, and it sort of is what it is. It will get you started on storytelling and how to think about it. But also on the website, you can download a free, the free section of the book to see if it's something you'd be interested in.
That's awesome. What book number is this for you? You've written other books as well. How many have you written so far?
This is my 6th book, so 6th published book, which is quite astounding, because if someone had told me I would have written 1 book, I wouldn't have believed them. My final teacher in final year of school, English, I actually failed English. I wasn't a very good student, and I failed English. So it just goes to show what good editors can do. But it's my 6th book, and they're all sort of on storytelling or, authentic leadership, real communication.
You have a 7th one in you? Yeah,
I do. I've always got a couple of books on the go, but I sometimes secretly start writing them, because I think I've got a book in my head, and sometimes I get to like about 5,000 words and go, oh, that's it, I'm done. And I go, maybe that's just a couple of articles. It's not really a book.
Not a full book. Well, it's an accomplishment, and we'll definitely be looking forward to that when it comes out. Gabrielle, thank you so much for being on the show today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Eric.